The complaints started the day after I laid down the mat, a simple, hand-woven welcome sign. By the third week, someone had tried to burn it. It started on a quiet Tuesday morning when I laid it out, a thick, hand-woven doormat I had crafted over the course of several weekends. The threads were coarse, natural fiber, stitched tightly with an intricate border of geometric patterns. In the center, it simply said, "Welcome," but wasn't mass-produced. The font was irregular, stylized with curves and angles that looked ancient to some, cryptic to others. To me, it was comforting, a piece of myself outside my front door, where very little ever felt personal. The first note came the next morning. Folded neatly and left under the mat like a calling card, it read, "Some things are better kept inside your home." No signature. I almost laughed. It sounded like something from a bad thriller. But when I looked up and scanned the tidy, uniform houses around me, the weight settled in. Someone didn't like the mat. Not the color. Not the message. Just the mat itself. And they were watching closely enough to respond within 24 hours. I tossed the note and dismissed it. I told myself maybe it was a prank or a misplaced message meant for someone else. But then came a second one, slipped through the screen door this time. Not appropriate for this community. Still unsigned, typed again in the same bland font that erased any trace of emotion. That afternoon, I noticed a woman across the street standing with her arms folded, just watching. Her yard was immaculate. Every blade of grass measured like military protocol. Her porch had symmetrical planters, polished brass numbers. I didn't know her name then, but I noticed the way her lips pressed into a hard line when our eyes met. Later that week, I received a formal letter from the HOA, informing me that my property was under aesthetic review. I didn't know that was a thing. They referenced vague rules about decorative elements and community harmony, but no specific violation. I called to ask. They told me it was a result of multiple complaints. When I asked for copies, I was told they were anonymous. When I pushed harder, I was told, plainly, it's about the mat. Now I was paying attention. I reviewed the bylaws. There were no restrictions about doormats beyond safety concerns. Nothing about style, message, or material. Still, something about the mat was setting someone off, and that someone had influence. In the following days, subtle things began to shift. I found my garbage bins tipped over on pickup day. Not a major incident, but had never happened before. A package left on my porch was mysteriously opened before I got to it. One night, I came home and found the mat flipped over, the underside caked in dirt, pressed down as if someone had stomped on it. No other signs of disturbance. Just the mat, reversed like someone wanted to send a message without leaving fingerprints. I installed a camera above the door the next morning. The footage from that week showed what I already suspected. Around 2 a.m., a hooded figure approached the porch, knelt silently, flipped the mat over, and walked away. The footage was grainy, but the posture, the gait, something about it felt deliberately familiar. Not a stranger, not a thief. Someone who lived here. Someone who wanted me to know they were near, but not close enough to be caught. I showed the footage to a few neighbors. Most shrugged. One of them, an older woman who walked her dog early each day, leaned in and said, "You know she's on the HOA board, right?" I asked who. She only nodded toward the house across the street. The woman with the perfect yard. "Karen," she said like it explained everything. From that point forward, I began to notice the pattern. The same woman who trimmed her hedges daily, who stared from her window when anything out of place happened, always seemed to be nearby when I was outside. She never spoke to me directly. But once, I caught her snapping a photo on my porch from the sidewalk. No phone call, no complaint to my face, just silent documentation, like I was a case file waiting for closure. The mat became more than a decoration. It became a point of tension, an invisible boundary. I cleaned it daily, adjusted it so the message faced outward, never curled at the edges. I wanted it to be undeniable. I wanted her to see it every time she passed. That simple word, welcome, had become a quiet act of rebellion. But I was also scared. One night, I came home late from work to find the mat damp. Not rain damp. There hadn't been any. I bent down and smelled it. It reeked of lighter fluid. That was when the fear fully settled in. Someone had tried to burn it. Only a corner was singed. A small, charred triangle like a warning. They hadn't succeeded, or maybe they hadn't meant to finish the job. But it was clear this wasn't a disagreement anymore. This was a threat. I called the police, filed a report. They logged it as vandalism, but the officer was polite and unconvinced. "It's a doormat," he said, almost apologetic. "Hard to prove intent." He handed me a card and told me to call if it escalated. He never asked why someone would go after it in the first place. I didn't have an answer then. I only had a question. Why does this mat make someone so angry? It wasn't until much later, after the cameras, after the meetings, after the news story, that I discovered the answer wasn't about the mat at all. It was about what it represented. She wasn't hard to spot once I knew what to look for. Her routine was surgically precise. Garden work at exactly 7:30 a.m., standing upright every few minutes to scan the street like a sentry. In the evenings, she'd walk a measured loop around the cul-de-sac, clipboard in hand, occasionally jotting something down. No smile, no nod, just silent surveillance. Karen, as my neighbor had confirmed, was more than just a resident. She was the unofficial sheriff of our block. And now I was the criminal. The day after the attempted burning, I reviewed the overnight footage again. The shadowy figure matched the build I'd seen before. Lean, confident stride, slightly hunched posture, like someone used a creeping unnoticed. I paused the video at the moment they turned, not toward the mat, but toward the camera. A flash of cheekbone under the hoodie. The motion was deliberate. She wanted me to know it was her, or at least to make me doubt it enough that I couldn't act. That kind of psychological warfare didn't happen on impulse. I printed the clear still and held it beside a photo I'd taken of Karen during one of her sidewalk patrols. The resemblance was too close to ignore. But there was no smoking gun, just suspicion, implication, and a growing certainty in my gut that this wasn't about a mat anymore. It was about control. I started doing some quiet digging. Through the HOA's online portal, I found board member profiles, all sanitized and brief. Karen's listed her as Community Aesthetics Officer, a meaningless title that sounded important, giving her just enough of a platform to project authority. I scrolled through minutes from previous HOA meetings and saw her name attached to an alarming number of citations. Porch light brightness, mailbox paint colors, improper flag display, even wind chime lengths. She'd weaponized the rulebook, and now she was using it on me. One evening, I waited until she began her loop before stepping out onto my lawn. I stood there, arms folded, pretending to water a patch of already soaked grass. When she approached, she slowed down, not stopping, not speaking, just enough to make her presence felt. Her eyes flicked toward the mat and then back to my face. I nodded politely. She didn't respond, just kept walking. That silence said more than words ever could. The next week, a formal HOA violation letter arrived, this time citing non-compliant personal decor. I asked for clarification. They sent back a photo. It was the mat. The grainy, zoomed-in picture had been taken from across the street, confirming what I'd seen. Karen was documenting me. I wrote back citing the lack of any specific bylaw, attaching a screenshot of the community handbook. Days later, the HOA responded with a vague, evasive message about pending review. It was bureaucratic harassment, perfectly disguised. Around this time, I started hearing whispers from other neighbors. A man across the street, quiet, rarely seen, waved me down one morning. He said his kids had once left chalk art on the driveway, and within hours, Karen had filed a noise complaint. Another woman, 2 doors down, told me Karen reported her to animal control because her dog barked during the mail delivery. A pattern emerged. Anyone who stood out, who brought color or individuality to the block, was quickly marked. But unlike others, I hadn't backed down. That made me dangerous. I began documenting everything. Every letter, every screenshot, every timestamp video clip. I created a folder, printed backups. I wasn't just reacting now, I was preparing. If this went any further, I'd have proof. Then came the meeting. The HOA held quarterly gatherings at the local community center, a sterile, fluorescent-lit room where complaints and updates were exchanged under the illusion of democracy. I arrived early, matte photo folder in hand, unsure of what I was walking into. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by two other board members who looked more bored than biased. She spotted me immediately, her lips pursed in that now-familiar tight line. When public comment opened, I stood. Calmly, I outlined the situation, the vague citations, the escalating intimidation, the harassment disguised as policy. I handed out printouts. I played the burn mat clip on a small tablet and passed it around. Gasps, murmurs, then silence. Karen didn't speak for a moment. Then she offered a small, humorless smile. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "We'll take it under advisement." The meeting adjourned. No resolution. No argument. Just that same eerie stillness, like I'd stepped on something dangerous without even knowing it. The next morning, my mailbox was left open. Inside was another note, this one handwritten. Block letters. You should think about moving. There was no mistaking it now. She wasn't just trying to get rid of the mat. She was trying to get rid of me. But I wasn't leaving. Not anymore. That afternoon, I called a friend from college, someone I remembered had done investigative freelance writing. I sent her everything. She was immediately hooked. "This isn't just about a mat," she said. "This is about abuse of authority in micro-communities." Let me dig. While she researched, I doubled down on my routine. Clean mat. Lights on. Security, signs posted. I made myself visible. And every time Karen walked past my lawn, we made eye contact. It became a standoff. She knew I knew. I knew she couldn't prove anything yet. But the balance was shifting. A week later, my friend called me with a revelation. Karen had been removed from a previous HOA board in another state, forced to resign after multiple harassment complaints. It hadn't made the news, but it was documented in housing court records. She sent me the files. They matched the behavior perfectly. Suddenly, I understood the full picture. Karen wasn't just particular. She was pathological, someone who needed order, control, and the power to punish anyone who disrupted it. The mat was a symbol she couldn't erase. And now, she was slipping. I didn't know how far she would go. But I knew one thing for sure. She had underestimated me. The third citation came wrapped in false politeness, signed off by the HOA with a line that read, "We appreciate your attention to community standards." This time, they claimed the mat was causing visual discord. It sounded like something out of a dystopian HOA satire, but the implications weren't funny anymore. With each letter, each warning, Karen was building a paper trail, one that could one day justify a fine, a lien, even forced removal. She wasn't just escalating. She was setting the groundwork for something bigger. She was preparing for war. I hadn't changed the mat. Not once. But my silence, my refusal to comply, had painted a target on me. And now the tone had shifted. It was no longer about a difference in taste. It was personal. One morning, I walked outside to find my garden lights torn out of the soil. The wires had been cut cleanly, snipped at the base with something sharp. No signs of animals, no wind damage. Just a neat act of sabotage. I checked the footage, but whoever did it had approached from the side, a blind spot I hadn't covered yet. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone knew the layout of my security. Someone who watched closely. I reported the incident. The police made another note. That was all they could do. Without video or a witness, there's not much to go on, the officer said again, just like last time. I asked if it could be part of a pattern. He raised an eyebrow. "You think this is related to a mat?" He tried not to smile. They didn't get it. Not yet. But the pattern was real. Everything from the clipped wires to the shifted trash bins to the way Karen seemed to appear every time I stepped outside. It wasn't random. It was strategic. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. She wanted me uncomfortable in my own home. Then came the night of the break-in attempt. It was just after midnight. I was in bed when I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal. A lock. I jumped up, grabbed my phone, and ran to the front hallway. The handle was jiggling. Just once. Then again. A pause. Then footsteps retreating across the porch. I waited until the sound disappeared entirely before opening the door. The mat was gone. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But the square patch of dust where it had always rested was clear. My doormat, the symbol of this entire mess, had vanished without a trace. I checked the footage immediately. At 12:14 a.m., someone approached wearing gloves, a hoodie, and dark jeans. They didn't even look at the camera this time. Just bent down, snatched the mat, and walked off into the dark. Not hurried, calm, intentional. I paused the footage, enhanced it, and there was the same familiar posture, the same lean frame. Karen. Only this time, she wasn't trying to intimidate me. She was trying to erase me. But the story didn't end there. At dawn, I walked the block. 5 houses down, in the alley between 2 fences, I found it, the mat, ripped into strips, soaked in something oily, partially burned. It was still smoldering faintly, the fabric curling at the edges like dying leaves. I stood over it, staring. There was no mistaking what this was. A message. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was an attack. I called the police again, and this time I demanded escalation. I had video. I had the evidence. The officer who arrived was different, more serious. He looked at the footage, took notes, and promised to log it as vandalism with intent. I handed him a USB with the video clips and photos. "Do you know who it was?" he asked. I hesitated. Then I said, "I have a very strong idea." He didn't ask for a name. Maybe he already knew. The fallout began immediately after I made the report public. I didn't blast it on social media. Not yet. Instead, I compiled everything into a file and sent it to the HOA, marked confidential. I titled it, Targeted Harassment, Documentation of Misconduct by HOA Board Member. I sent copies to every board member but Karen. That evening, she came to my door. It was the first time she ever spoke directly to me. She didn't knock. She didn't wait. She just stood there, arms folded, her mouth pressed into that sharp, joyless expression. "You're really determined to stir things up, aren't you?" she said. I didn't answer. I simply pointed to the camera mounted above my door. Its red recording light glowed steadily. She glanced up, then back at me. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she said quietly. "People like you never last in neighborhoods like this." I didn't flinch. "People like you don't get to decide that anymore." She turned and walked away without another word. But I saw her jaw tighten, her stride sharpen. That was the moment I knew she felt it, the control slipping through her fingers. The next day, something shifted. I received no mail, none of the usual ads or envelopes. When I checked the camera footage, I saw the postal worker pass by, pause at my mailbox, look confused, and walk on. I checked the box. The door had been wedged shut with something inside. A hardened wad of glue or sealant. Tampered, just enough to delay delivery. I cleared it out and filed yet another report. This time, I copied the journalist friend I had contacted weeks before. She called me within the hour. "This is it," she said. "This is the story. It's not just about the mat. It's about personal targeting, manipulation of power, and suburban suppression disguised as civility." I gave her everything. And while she prepared the story for publication, I prepared for the next attack. But it didn't come. Not a broken light. Not a move bin. Not a single note. Karen vanished from her porch walks. No more clipboard. No more glances. She had gone silent. I knew better than to think it was over. But something was cracking. Something fundamental. She had tried to erase me, erase the mat. And when that failed, she disappeared. The mat was destroyed, but the message wasn't. It lived now in photos, in video, in conversation. In the eyes of neighbors who had once avoided me, but now waved with caution and curiosity. It had started as a quiet rebellion, a stitch design meant to say, "You are seen." Now it was something else entirely. And Karen had no idea how loud silence could be. I had stared at that mat for hours after finding what was left of it. Charred, soggy threads, the word welcome barely legible through the ash and soot. Something about the destruction of it gnawed at me. And not just because it had become a symbol in this strange neighborhood war. I kept asking myself, why that much effort? Why that level of rage? No other doormat on the street was targeted. Just mine. It wasn't obscene. It wasn't political. But Karen reacted as if it had personally attacked her. That level of vitriol didn't come from someone simply offended by decor. It came from a deeper place. I salvaged the biggest surviving piece, the corner with part of the border pattern, and brought it inside. There, on my kitchen table under bright light, I examined the weaving. It wasn't random. I'd chosen the design from a book my grandmother gave me years ago, old cultural patterns she had carried with her from a place she could never return to. To me, they were just warm, familiar shapes. But now I began to wonder if they meant more to someone else. I sent a photo of the burn mat fragment to a friend, Jasmine, who studied visual anthropology and cultural symbolism. She responded in minutes. "That's resistance weaving," she said. I blinked at the message. Resistance? Jasmine sent a few examples for comparison. Woven fabric used during civil conflicts, designed by minority artisans in regions where open protest was dangerous. These weren't just decorative symbols, they were codes. Quiet, subversive acts of communication. The specific pattern I had used was rooted in a history of defiance, hidden in plain sight. I didn't even realize what I had done. The spiraled border that looked like a geometric flourish to me, it mimicked the traditional warning symbol from an oppressed community. A way of saying, "We are still here." The central loops that shaped the font of the word, "welcome," mirrored unity symbols found in banned protest tapestries. Would have been an innocent design choice on my part had hit a nerve I didn't know was exposed. The implications began to settle like dust after a storm. Karen didn't just see a mat. She saw something she recognized, or thought she did. And instead of asking, instead of understanding, she declared war. Why? That's when Jasmine dropped the second bombshell. I ran a reverse image search and found a digital archive of similar patterns. One of them was tied to a case study. Someone had tried to have art removed from a community space, citing offensive political messaging. Guess who signed the complaint? She sent me a name. Karen's full name. I opened the article. There she was, in a grainy protest photo, years younger, face stiff with the same expression I'd come to know. The complaint had failed. The art had stayed. But the notes from the case were telling. Karen had argued that subtle cultural markers were a threat to neighborhood neutrality, a phrase that at first sounded bureaucratic, but now felt unmistakably loaded. She didn't hate my mat because it was just different. She hated it because it represented everything she had spent years trying to suppress. Symbols of voices she didn't want heard, stories she didn't want told. Suddenly, everything clicked. The rage, the fire, the unrelenting campaign to erase it. My doormat wasn't the first target. It was just the most recent. I felt sick, not just from the realization, but from the weight of what it meant. I hadn't been fighting over fiber and dye. I've been standing on the front lines of a cultural battle without even knowing I was holding a flag. The next step wasn't fear. It was clarity. I began documenting the historical context of the design, screenshots from cultural archives, notes from Jasmine, art history citations. I compiled everything into a digital folder titled The Mat, Symbol and Story. And then I shared it. I emailed it to every HOA board member. I posted a curated version on a local community group under a pseudonym. I told the story, not of Karen, not of the vandalism, but of the mat itself. Its origin, its design, its message. The response was quiet at first. A few comments, some reactions. Then, slowly, private messages began to arrive. A woman 2 streets over thanked me. Said her grandmother used to weave the same pattern in secret. A man messaged to say he'd grown up seeing those same symbols in a family quilt they were told to keep hidden during neighborhood inspections. They hadn't realized what it meant until now. The mat had done something Karen didn't expect. It had spoken, and people were listening. I even received a message from a local art curator, someone who specialized in grassroots resistance artifacts. He asked to speak with me, cautiously at first. Then he asked if he could see the salvaged piece in person. When he arrived, I handed him the scorched fragment. He held it with a reverence I wasn't prepared for. "People think protest has to be loud," he said, "but sometimes it's just a thread that refuses to break." He left with photographs and context, promising to submit it for inclusion in a new exhibit on everyday defiance. It wasn't a guarantee, but even the possibility meant everything. The next time I passed Karen's house, her porch was empty. The clipboard was gone. Her blinds were closed for the first time in weeks. For once, she wasn't watching. But I was. And now, so was everyone else. The mat was gone, but its echo had grown louder than any argument, any violation notice, any attempt to silence it. It had become what Karen feared most, a symbol no longer under her control. She had tried to burn it out of existence. Instead, she'd ignited something she could never extinguish. I sat across from the reporter in a quiet corner of the local library, the last place anyone would expect a conversation like this to unfold. She had a notebook, not a laptop, and a kind of stillness about her that made you forget she was collecting every word. I had just finished recounting everything: the mat, the notes, the burned fabric, the cultural history. She looked at me, eyes steady, and said, "This isn't just a story. This is a pattern, and people need to see it." She wasn't talking about the stitching. What I had thought was a bizarre, personal feud over porch decor had revealed itself to be something more layered. This wasn't just about Karen's obsession. It was about the weaponization of authority, about how personal prejudice hides behind rules, and how people like her use the sterile language of aesthetics and community standards to smother anything that threatened their idea of normal. I sent her the footage, the HOA letters, even the original digital files of the mat's design. She promised anonymity for the time being. It wasn't about naming Karen. It was about showing how systems that claim to protect can be twisted to intimidate. As she left, she said, "You're not alone in this. You just happen to be one of the few who documented it." The article was published 3 days later. It ran under the headline, "When a Doormat Becomes a Battleground: Suburban Control and Cultural Suppression." The piece was meticulous, sharp, and damning. It never named Karen, but anyone in our neighborhood would recognize her. The story laid bare the tactics used to harass without touching, to silence without shouting. The burn mat was featured in a high-res photo. Alongside it, a caption, "A welcome they tried to destroy." That's when everything changed. The first sign was the sudden presence of silence from Karen's house. For someone who had spent months documenting every misaligned trash bin, she had become oddly invisible. No porch patrols, no HOA emails. Then came the emergency board meeting. It was announced hastily, just a single sheet taped to the community bulletin: "Special HOA session. All residents welcome." The room was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Not because people cared about the mat, but because now they knew what had happened. The story had sparked something. People remembered their own grievances, their own fines and citations, and whispered warnings. Everyone had at least one Karen story, and now those stories had a name. I didn't speak that night. I didn't have to. Others did. One man told a story about being fined for placing a pride flag in his window for 1 day. Another spoke of her teenage son being reported for loitering while waiting outside for a ride. A young couple described how their porch plants were labeled invasive and forcibly removed. One by one, the stories poured out, and though they were different, they all pointed back to the same pattern of surveillance, punishment, and quiet cruelty. Karen sat 2 seats from the center of the table, stiff as stone. Then the final blow came. The curator I had spoken to weeks before had followed through. He had written to the board himself a formal statement detailing how the mat's design had historical significance, cultural value, and symbolic weight. He included images, research, and his own plans to exhibit it in a gallery dedicated to subversive art forms and protest textiles. "This object," he wrote, "is not just a household item. It is part of a larger story, and it deserves to be preserved." It was the closest thing to justice I'd seen in this entire ordeal. Karen resigned the next morning. No announcement, no farewell, just a brief notice posted on the HOA website. Board member Karen M. has stepped down effective immediately. No one asked why. Everyone already knew. Her blinds stayed drawn after that. Her lawn, once obsessively manicured, began to yellow. The symmetry she'd spent years building began to fray at the edges. Some said she was embarrassed. Others thought she was simply regrouping. I didn't care. I wasn't watching her anymore. The neighborhood had started to shift. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. There were more porch plants now. More welcome mats. Different languages. Colors. It was like everyone had quietly agreed to reclaim their space. And as for the mat, it was no longer on my porch, but it was very much alive. The curator reached out again, this time with a formal request. He wanted to acquire the surviving piece for permanent display. The exhibit would be called "Ordinary Objects, Extraordinary Resistance." The mat fragment would be mounted under glass, accompanied by a short plaque detailing its origin, the attempt to erase it, and what it came to symbolize. I agreed. The day it was installed, he invited me to the opening. I went alone, dressed plain. No one knew who I was, just someone standing in front of a burned piece of fabric mounted on a wall. But I saw people stop and read. I watched a woman wipe her eyes. A young man took a photo. A child asked his mother why someone would burn a mat. I listened as she explained the best she could. Sometimes, people get angry at what they don't understand, she said. But that doesn't mean we hide who we are. That's when I knew it had all been worth it. Karen had tried to erase something she couldn't control. She failed, and in doing so, she amplified the very thing she feared. The mat was no longer something people wiped their feet on. It was something they stood in front of. And finally, someone else had to face it. The exhibit hall was modest, nestled between a gallery of urban street art and a room dedicated to protest photography, but the lighting made everything inside glow like it mattered. Framed textiles, stitched banners, and protest garments lined the walls. Each artifact a quiet defiance captured in fabric and thread. Near the back, surrounded by a soft ring of light, was the glass display that stopped most people mid-step. Inside it sat the scorched remnant of my doormat, the curled edge still blackened by fire, the once bold lines of its design faded but intact. Below it, a plaque read, "Welcome Resistance, Anonymous, Suburban Midwest, 2024. Donated by the artist. Removed by force. Reclaimed by memory." I stood there longer than I meant to, watching strangers drift up to it, lean in, whisper to each other. No one knew it was mine. That was the point. I didn't need to own it anymore. The story belonged to whoever stood in front of it now. The first time I'd laid that mat down on my porch, I never imagined it would leave the neighborhood, let alone end up behind glass. It was a small, hand-woven thing, a personal project, a nod to heritage, a gesture of warmth. But now it carried something far larger. It had become an artifact, not of war, but of resistance. Not because of what it was, but because of what someone else had tried to make it mean and what they failed to destroy. Back home, the absence of the mat was noticeable, but not in the way I expected. For weeks I thought I'd feel exposed, like a piece of me had been taken. But instead, there was a strange peace in the empty space. The door, the porch, the steps, they all felt clean, reclaimed. I had already won the fight, not because Karen left or because the HOA quieted down, but because I hadn't been erased. Karen didn't move out, though I know many people assumed she would. Her house still stood across the street, now slightly neglected. The symmetry was gone. The hedges hadn't been trimmed in weeks. Weeds poked through the mulch. Her porch light flickered at night. But the most noticeable change was her. She no longer paced with her clipboard. She didn't inspect driveways. She didn't look into anyone's yard. She looked down. We hadn't spoken since that night. She came to my door. She didn't acknowledge me when we passed in the street, and I didn't expect her to. But something had shifted. Her war had ended in silence. And silence now was the loudest thing she could offer. Everyone else knew. The neighborhood had been a quiet place before, but now it was alive with small rebellions. One by one, others started expressing themselves in ways they hadn't before. A colorful mat outside a door that used to be bare. A new planter box filled with bright, clashing flowers. A hand-painted mailbox that broke uniformity. Flags. Chalk art. Wind chimes. Someone even placed a stone sculpture of an elephant on their front lawn. An inside joke, I'm sure, but bold in its own way. No one received citations. The HOA board quietly voted in 2 new members after Karen's departure. They rewrote sections of the guideline book, making it clearer what could and couldn't be enforced. Taste was no longer a metric. Harmony was removed as a rule. The language now emphasized safety, inclusivity, and respect. Words that meant something. I was asked to join the board. I declined. My work was never about authority. It was about the right to exist as I am, quietly, without needing permission. Sometimes, neighbors would approach me, not to talk about the mat, but just to talk. We were no longer strangers navigating a rigid system. There was a sense of breath in the air, like something tight had been released. One afternoon, a woman I barely knew stopped me while I was watering my plants. She said, "I always wanted to paint my door purple, but I was afraid." I smiled. A few days later, her door was purple. Karen never said a word. Months passed and a season. I visited the exhibit once more before they rotated it out. The curator told me it would be part of a traveling collection next, a series on the intersection of everyday life and cultural resistance. He asked if I'd be open to being credited by name, now that the story was known. I said no, not because I was afraid, but because anonymity was what had protected the message in the first place. Let it be anyone's story. Let it be everyone's. That winter, I stitched another mat. Not a replica, a new one. It was brighter, deep reds and burnt oranges, with a border of weaving that Jasmine helped me design. This time, the symbols weren't from a book passed down in secrecy. They were mine, a blend of old and new. Unity patterns reimagined. No coded meanings, just presence. I placed it on my porch on a quiet morning, snow just beginning to fall. Across the street, Karen's curtain moved, but only slightly. A shadow at the edge. I didn't flinch. She didn't come out. I stepped back, looked down at the mat, and for the first time in months, didn't wonder if someone would try to take it away. The mat in the museum had its story. It had served its purpose. But here, in front of my home, was the continuation, not resistance, but renewal. There are some things that don't survive fire. And then there are those that come through it not just whole, but changed, stronger, sharper, louder in their silence. The new mat said, "Welcome, too." But this time, it wasn't a warning or a challenge. It was a promise.